Hi guys, this is Dr. Rosales. So our topic for today is about activity-based costing. So we are on our module 6, okay? So expect in this module that you will be recognizing the difference between traditional costing and asset-based costing, identifying the steps in the development of the activity-based costing, know how companies identify their activity cost pools using the ABC, and identify the use cost driver in activity-based costing, as well as to understand the benefits and the limitations of ABC or the active-based costing. So, during the discussion, may mga makikita kayo diyang in relation to this topic. So, ito yung featured story natin wherein some of the activities or some of the examples are based from Super Bakery Incorporated. So, what is the content of our lesson? Syempre, under ABC or the activity-based costing, we have the traditional costing and ABC, the example of the ABC versus the traditional, a closer look about the benefit of ABC, and several examples about ABC and traditional costing examples. Okay? So, lesson 1 will be dealing or recognizing the difference between traditional costing and the activity-based costing. It is probably impossible to determine the exact cost of a product or a service. However, in order for us to achieve improved management decisions, companies often strive to provide decision makers with the most accurate cost estimate that they can. Okay? The most accurate estimate of product cost occurs when the costs are traceable directly to the products produced or the service provided. Okay? So direct materials and direct labor costs are the easiest to trace directly to the product through the use of material requisition forms. Okay? And payroll timesheets, ganon. Okay? So overhead costs are the indirect or most common costs that are generally cannot be easily or directly traced to individual products or services. So, pinag-aralan natin before about the overhead cost, no? Okay, so instead, companies use estimates this time to assign the overhead cost to products and services kasi hindi nga naman madaling mahanap or ma-determine kaagad ang ating overhead cost. Okay, so the most difficult part of computing accurate units is determining the proper amount of overhead costs to assign to each products, services, or a job. So, minsan dito yung mga, lalo na yung mga maliliit na mga companies, pag sinabi nating overhead, sige, lagay na lang sila na lagay, hindi nila alam kung paano determine yung proper amount of overhead costs. Okay? So, the rate was called the predetermined overhead cost kasi yun yung plant-wide overhead rate na tinatawag nila, okay? So, dito, yung rate na tinatawag natin, which is the plant-wide overhead rate throughout the year, is the predetermined overhead cost. For job order costing, we assume that direct labor cost was the relevant activity based from assigning all overhead cost to job. Okay, so for process costing, we assume that machine hours was the relevant activity base for assigning all the process of the department. So, tingnan nyo ha, pagdating sa job costing, ang ating activity base is we call the direct labor cost. While sa process costing naman, which we will be discussing for the next module, is we assume that yung machine hour was the relevant activity base for assigning the overhead cost. Okay? So, you have to determine kung ano yung mga overhead costs that you will be incurring for the whole year. So, yun yung dalawang example natin, the direct labor for us to determine the job order costing. While doon naman sa process costing, machine hours naman yung ginamit nating relevant activity relative activity base for assigning the overhead. Okay, so the use of direct labor as the activity base made sense when overhead cost allocation system were first developed. Okay, at the time, direct labor made up a larger portion of manufacturing costs. So, it is widely accepted that there had a higher correlation, the correlation between direct labor and incurrence of overhead. Okay, so as a result, direct labor become the most popular basis for allocating the overhead. So, yun yung unang pa yung traditional costing method nila. Ito yun. So, ito yung illustration natin of the traditional one-stage costing. And even today's increasing environment, direct labor is sometimes the appropriate basis for assigning overhead pa rin to products. Okay? It is appropriate to use direct labor, especially when direct labor constitute of a significant part of the product cost. Okay, so as you can see from the illustration, it displays a simplified one-stage traditional costing relying on what we call the direct labor to assign the overhead. Okay, so next natin is the need of the new approach. Ano ba yung tinatawag natin the need of new approach? Sorry for this error, asset-based, which is dapat yan is activity-based. Okay, so in recent years, most of the manufacturing and service provider have experience change. Okay, so advances in computerized system, meron na sila mga innovation, global competition. So, as a result, yung direct labor na ginagamit nila noon, nag-decrease na siya and a total overhead cost resulting from the depreciation of the machines and machineries, mga repairs, mga maintenance have significantly increased. So there is no correlation na ngayon about direct labor and overhead. Okay, so it is inappropriate to use the plant-wide predetermined yung sinasabi natin kanina na pag job costing, direct labor yon. Pag process costing, machine hours yon. So there's no need for that or inappropriate to use the plant-wide predetermined overhead rates based on direct labor cost because companies that use overhead rates based on direct labor, even though this correlation does not exist, still experience the significant cost distortion. That's why most of the company nowadays are using this what we call the acid-based costing. So acid-based costing is a method that uses multiple bases. Okay, so the ABC allocates overhead to multiply activities. Okay, to understand this more clearly, you need to apply some new meanings to the rather common sounding words that make up the definition. Okay, so in activity-based costing, an activity na word is an event, an action, a transaction, or work sequence that incurs costs when producing a product or providing a service. Okay? So, it's an action. Okay? A sequence or an activity cost an activity cost pool na tinatawag naman is the overhead costs attributed to the distinct type of activity such as yung ordering materials or setting up the machine. Yun yung tinatawag nating activity cost pool. It is the overhead attributed to the activities, distinctive na activities like ordering materials or setting up a machine. Okay, so under it pa rin, itong cost driver na tinatawag natin is any factor or activity that has a direct cause and effect relationship with the resources consumed. Okay? So the reasoning that behind ABC or the acid-based costing allocation is simple. Products, consumed activity, and activities, consumed resources. So, yun yung definition of ABC to at least alam natin how ABC works. Okay? So, ABC allocates overhead into stage process. Yung first stage natin is it allocates overhead to activity cost pool. Okay? Malinaw tayo doon ha. So, yung meaning behind the allocation cost is relevantly simple because the products, it consumes activities. And the activities naman, o yung paggawa, is it consumes resources. Okay? So, the first stage for allocating the overhead costs to activity cost pool. Ulitin ko ulit yung meaning ng activity cost pool ha. Activity cost pool is the overhead cost attributed to a distinctive type of activity. So, product consumes activity. Okay? So, going back, the first stage, allocate overhead costs to activity cost pool. So, alam nyo na yung mga activity cost pool natin yun ha. Yun yung mga allocations of cost to different jobs or different departments. So, example of overhead cost pool na tinatawag natin yung pag-order ng materials or ordering materials, setting up machines, assembling the product, inspecting the product. So, lahat ng mga yon is under activity cost pool. Okay? Malinaw tayo doon. Yun yung first step for yan. So, I'll give you an illustration here about activity cost pool or activity related to cost driver naman. Okay? So, yung una ito, kung mapapansin ninyo, the activity cost pool. So, sabi natin na simpleng illustration ng ABC is products consumes activities and activities consumes resources. Okay? So, going back to the explanation, examples of overhead, balikan ko muna dito para hindi kayo malito. Okay, so examples of overhead cost pool is ordering materials, setting up machines, assembling products, and inspecting products. The second stage assigns the overhead allocated to the activity. Okay, so balikan ulit natin yung kanyang teorya kanina about the ABC allocation cost. Products consumes activities. So ngayon naman, after you allocate all the products to different pools, you need to assign the overhead allocated to the activity cost pools to products using cost drivers. Ito na yon, using the cost drivers. Okay, the cost driver measures the number of individual activities undertaken or performed to produce products or provide services. Okay, so examples are numbers of purchase orders, numbers of setups, the labor hours, and the numbers of inspections. So as you can see from the graph, this shows several examples of activities and possible cost driver to measure them for a company that manufactures two products, the axis and yung steering wheel. So, dalawang klaseng product yan. So, ito yung illustration. So, the first step, as you can see in the illustration, the company allocates overhead. Okay? So, ito yung mga nag-allocate sila ng mga overhead costs. Ito yung allocation of cost pools. Purchasing, storing, machine. So, these are the activities. Okay? In this example, the company had identified these four activity pools. Yung purchasing, the storing, machining, and the supervising. So, after the costs are allocated to the activity pools, the company use cost drivers now to determine the cost to assign to the individual products. It's either for the axle or the steering wheel. Okay, so based on each product, based on each product's use. of each activity. For example, kung yung Excel nagre-require ng mas maraming activity for the purchasing department as measured by the number of required purchase order, then more of the overhead cost from the purchasing pool will be allocated to the Excel. Okay? So, ito naman, another illustration. This design shows more complex activity-based cost system. Okay, so yung activity-based costing system with 7 activity cost pool. Okay, so kung makikita nyo dyan, example of the lift jack company, meron siyang 7 activity cost pool. So from the overhead, meron siyang 7. 2, 4, 6, 7. So ito yung activity cost pool. So yung sa activity cost pool na yon, ina-allocate nila yung mga different cost drivers naman. Kung saan nila ilalagay yung mga activities, kung ano yung mga nakukonsume nilang resources. Kasi sabi nga natin sa kanyang teorya that products consumes activities and activities consumes products. So, cost drivers na sinatawag natin are any factors or activity that has direct cause and effect relationship to the resources. Okay, so yan. Ito yung mga cost drivers niya. Ito yung activity pool natin. So, it shows more complex activity-based costing system with 7 cost pool. The lift jack company manufactures 2 automobile jacks or automobile scissor na tinatawag natin and track hydraulic. So, yan yung example ng mas complicated. Okay? So, yan yung pinaka nila na mas complicated. Okay? So, malinaw tayo dun guys regarding sa kung paano i-allocate or paano gumagana ang activity-based costing before we proceed to the comparison between ABC or the activity-based costing versus the traditional costing. Okay, so in this lesson, we present a simple case example, okay, that compares the activity-based costing with traditional costing. So, to illustrate it, the ABC, tingnan nyo yung case, the ABC eliminates the distortion that can occur to traditional overhead cost allocation. So, this example, you may understand that ABC does not replace an existing job order or a process costing system. So, what ABC or activity-based costing does is sinegregate niya ang overhead into various cost pool in an effort to provide more accurate cost information. So, ABC supplements rather than replace it. So, that's the cost system na tinatawag naman. Okay? So, assume that ito, yung case natin, assume that Atlas produces 2 automobile anti-theft devices. The booth is a high-volume item totaling to 25 units annually. So, the club is a low-volume item totaling only to 5 units per year. So, the direct cost per unit is 40 for the booth and 30 for the club. So, yun yung activity pool cost natin. So, direct labor naman is 12 per unit for each product. So, each product requires 1 hour of direct labor for completion. Therefore, total annual direct labor are 30,000. Okay, so 25 tsaka 5,000. So, expected annual manufacturing cost is 900,000. So, the predetermined overhead rate using traditional under direct labor is 30. Okay, so that is $900,000 to 30,000 labor cost. Okay, so $30 per labor hour. Since both products require 1 labor hours per unit, both products are allocated overhead cost of 30 per unit under traditional costing. Okay, so let's now compute or calculate using unit cost under ABC. Okay, so ito yon. So, ABC costing involves the following four steps. You have to consider the four. Number one, identify and classify and allocate overhead to cost pool. Diba? Sabi nga natin, products consumes activities, activities consumes resources. Okay, so number two, identify the cost driver. Three, compute. And four, assign. So I provide here a detailed explanation of the four steps. So step one. So tandaan nyo yung case kanina ha ni Atlas. Okay, so these are the informations in order for you to follow the discussion. Siguro screenshot nyo po yan before we proceed doon sa step 1 so that meron kayong copy na hindi na kayo pabalik-balik doon. Okay? So at least you have in your hand the copy of the case. Okay? So step 1, identify, sabi niya, and classify the activities and allocate overhead to cost pool. Okay, so a well-designed activity-based costing system should start with the analysis of the activities performed to manufacture a product or provide a service. So this analysis should identify all the resources consuming activities, guys, ha. Yung mga yan, setting up, machining, ganon. So it requires more on the documenting every activities undertaken to accomplish a task. Okay, so the company, Atlas Company, identified 3 activity cost pool: setting up, machining, and inspecting. So yan yung activity cost pool natin ha, from products consumes activities. So these are the activities. Okay, yung pool of activities natin. Okay, so next, the system assigns overhead cost directly to the appropriate activity cost pool. For example, overall costs directly associated with Atlas Company's machines such as salaries, supplies, and depreciation that would be assigned to the machine shop cost pool. Okay? So, itong illustration na to, kung paano natin i-compute yung the problem is, it shows the 3 cost pool. So, along with the estimated overhead allocated to each pool, then, after mo ma-identify, together with their allocated amount, let's proceed to the step 2, which is identifying naman the cost driver. So, unang-una, you have to identify the cost pool. Second one is to identify the cost drivers. Okay? So, after costs are allocated to the cost pool, the company must identify this. Okay? So, cost driver, ito na. Okay? So, the cost driver must accurately measure the actual consumption of the activity by the various products. To achieve accurate costing naman, a high degree of correlation must exist, guys, ha. So the cost driver and the actual consumption of the overhead costs should be presented para makita natin yung ito yung actual. Okay? So dapat it should be correlated. Hindi pwedeng 'di ba, you identify the cost pool, then the cost driver. So, dapat ang inyong expected use should be correlated. Okay? So, the availability and ease of obtaining the data relating to the cost driver is very important. That must be considered in the selection. So, number of setups. So, you have to count all the setups, all the machine works, kasi machining. So, machine works yun. Inspecting, so number of inspection. So, be very particular about the expected costs. So, it should be correlated lagi, okay? Next, pangatlo natin is you have to compute the overhead rates. So, computing the activity-based overhead rate per cost driver by dividing the estimated overhead per activity by the number of cost driver expected. Okay, so setting up, 300,000 divided by 1,500 setup. So per setup is 200. So you will be identifying the activity-based overhead rates. Okay, so ganyan ang pag-compute guys ha. So at last computes its activity-based rates by using estimated overhead per activity pool. Okay? So, next natin is itong example dito sa baba. The computations naman shows that per setup, makikita natin kung magkano. So, ito yung activity pool divided by the cost driver. Then, makukuha natin yung overhead. Okay? So, next natin or the step 4 after computing the overhead rate is for you to assign overhead costs to each products. To each products, okay? Or to the products. In assigning such, it is necessary for us to know the expected use of cost driver for each product. Tandaan nyo ha, for each product because of its low volume, the club requires more setups. Kung makikita nyo dyan, more setups and inspection than the booth. Okay, so the illustration shows here, makikita nyo dyan that the expected use of cost driver per product for each of Atlas product. Okay, so to assign overhead cost to each product, Atlas multiply the activity-based overhead rate na nakuha natin doon sa ito, yung illustration 4.7 by the number of the cost driver expected to be used per product. Ito naman. Okay? So, nakita nyo na? Yan. So, ganyan lang siya kadali kung paano makompute lahat or mai-apply lahat yung 4 steps under ABC costing system. Okay? So, I hope na naintindihan po natin yan kasi doon sa problem natin, we have 4 problems that includes how to compute for the ABC system. Okay? So, to summarize everything, this is the illustration naman ng overhead assigned to each products. Okay? So, ito yung pinaka-summary niya. Yung cost pool to product naman to. Okay, so setting up the machine, these are the activity pools, cost drivers natin, the overhead rates, so these are the costs assigned. Okay, so ito naman yung cost driver natin per product ng club. So dalawa yan ha. Tapos ang kanyang rate, then the cost assigned para malaman natin. Okay, so using all the formulas here, we have the overhead cost per unit ng unang product at ng pangalawang product na sa unang product is 17, then sa pangalawang product is 19. Okay, so this is a comparison of units manufacturing cost under the traditional costing and the ABC system. Okay, so ito yun, comparing the cost units. Tignan nyo yung dalawa. So here, the comparison that unit costs under traditional costing are significantly distorted. Okay? Yan. Kikita nyo siya na distorted siya or misleading. Diba? Okay. Next natin is, sensya na hinina ko kasi gabi na. Alas 2 na. Okay? So, the cost of producing the booth naman, look at the booth, is overstated by 13 per unit. Kung titignan ninyo, tignan nyo yung ano niya, itong traditional, ito yung using the ABC, mas accurate. Kasi dito sa traditional, di ba sabi natin kanina, sa traditional, umpisa pa lang, they have this predetermined overhead rate. Di ba? So, kino-compute na nila kung ilan at kung magkano yung dapat. While sa ABC, or the activity-based costing naman, accurate siya. It's because meron tayong tinatawag na sistema, which is product consumes, activities consumes, resources. So, doon na part, ina-identify natin yung activity cost pool, then the cost driver, before you can identify the overhead rate, then the specific or the exact overhead rate or expenses natin. Okay? So, look at the difference between the two. Ito yung traditional. If predetermined, these are the, di ba kanina, $30 yung unang-unang presentation natin. So, look at the difference of the two. Okay? So, the booth is overstated per unit doon sa traditional cost. Kasi, uh, the cost of producing naman the club is understated naman. So, hindi siya accurate, di ba? It is understated by 65 units because dun sa traditional, they computed 72 while dun sa using the activity-based costing naman is 137. So these differences are attributes entirely to how Atlas Company assigned manufacturing overhead. So most likely, the consequences of the differences in assigning overhead is that as Atlas have been overpricing the booth and possibly losing market share to the competitors, and it also been sacrificing the profitability by underpricing the club, 'di ba? So, dun pa lang makikita mo na that the booth, yung product nilang booth is overpriced. That's why they are losing more market share. Pag sinabi nating market share, guys, is yun yung capacity nila to produce for that specific demand. Okay? So, yung market share nila, ito lang ang kaya nilang i-produce. It's because nga, they are overstated with their expenses. So, akala nila, ang mahal-mahal na nagagastos nila sa cost, yung pala, pwede rin pala nilang babaan yung price nila kung itong klase ng computation na to using the activity base is nagawa na nila nung una pa. Kasi kung ang ina-adapt nila is the traditional cost, ang taas ng kanilang overhead. So, syempre, tataas din yung kanilang price. And dito naman kung i-compute nila talaga ng detail by detail using the ABC, mababa ang kanilang overhead expenses. So, most probably, kung alam nila ito, makakapagbenta sila ng product nila ng mas mababa pa sa price and mamimit nila yung market share. While dito, unknowingly, they are sacrificing the profitability by underpricing naman the club. Kasi ito yung cost nila. Pwede, maibenta nila yan. Bibenta nila yan mga 100 o lugi pa sila, di ba? So, they are sacrificing the profitability of the club na ano nila. So, activity-based costing was actually inumpisahan yan sa United States. Okay? So, inumpisahan yan ng isang company na tinatawag nilang John Deere Company. Okay, so 25 years nilang ginamit yan. Okay, so yung company na yon hindi lang man niya sinolo yon. Bali, binenta rin niya yung idea sa IBM, sa AT&T, sa HP, sa Procter & Gamble, so mga malaking company. Inadapt nila yung ABC, okay? Hanggang sa ginamit na rin siya sa ibang lugar, yun nga lang, limitado kasi the cost of implementation medyo mahal kasi nga syempre, it came from the foreign companies ng US, 'di ba? From John Deere, in-apply nila ng mga iba-ibang company pero hindi siya nag-push through sa mga malalapit na bansa. And even sa Pilipinas hindi siya nagamit that time kasi ang mahal. Syempre ang kanilang price is in dollar, okay? So sa Japan naman, hindi rin siya masyadong ginagamit. It is less widely used. So, most of the company prefer volume measures such as direct labor hours to assign overhead cost to products. Kasi mga Japanese managers, they are convinced that reducing direct labor is essential to cost reduction. Yun yung sa kanila, yun yung paniniwala nila. So, using direct labor as the basis for overhead allocation forces for the Japanese company to watch their direct labor is more important to them than to compute yung ganyan. Okay, so possibly, Japan management believe that cost labor reduction is more of a priority than developing more accurate product cost. So, dyan sila, kasi sila more on the quality lang naman sila eh. Pero pagdating sa mga ganito yung pag-reduce ng mga expenses, hindi sila masyadong ano dyan. Kasi para sa kanila, ang kanilang mantra is pag naibaba nila yung direct labor, then it will tantamount to cost reduction. Yun yung Yun yung mindset nila. Okay? So, naintindihan natin yan, the importance of ABC comparing sa traditional ABCs. Okay? So, let me give you the advantage of ABC. Okay? So, may mga advantage naman yan, benefits of ABC. So, number one, it leads to more cost pool. Okay? So, syempre, the more products na gusto mong magkaroon, syempre, magkakaroon ka rin ng different kinds of activities or the cost pool na tinatawag natin. Okay? Next natin is the ABC leads to enhanced control over overhead expenses, okay? So, syempre, yung if the company adopts the ABC, it enhance their control over the overhead expenses nila or overhead costs. Okay? Next natin is the benefit is it leads to better management decision. Doon naman lagi ang role ninyo as a financial managers, okay? Na it gives you better decisions. So activity-based cost does not change the amount of overhead. What is does to allocate those overhead is more inaccurate manner. So hindi niya binabawasan yung overhead cost. Yun nga lang, ina-allocate niya ng tama kung ilan talaga. Yun yung role ni ABC. Okay? So it's more on realistic, more accurate. So managers should better understand more the cost behavior ng company and for the overall profitability ng company. So bear in mind guys that ABC hindi niya binababaan yung overhead cost, kundi tinutulungan niya yung company to be more realistic and be more accurate in terms of identifying the overhead costs. Kasi that will be their basis for a better understanding of the cost behavior ng kanilang mga products and overall more on the profitability. Okay? So, but we also have two kinds of limitation in using the ABC. Uh, it can be expensive to use kasi it increase cost by identifying the multiple activities, syempre, 'di ba? And applying more numerous cost drivers, 'di ba? So, mahal nga. Then, pangalawa is the arbitrary allocation. So, even though more overhead expenses can be assigned directly to the product, using ABCs in a multiple activity, it can be allocated by means of volume-based control naman. So, it can also help, pero medyo maraming problema na mag-a-arise pag nag-allocate ka na nag-allocate. Dire-diretso yan, walang limit. That's why hindi rin effective siguro sa iba, kaya hindi siguro na-adapt ng mga Japanese. Yun nga lang, it can help. It can really help for the decision making lang. Although these are the limitations of it. Okay, so when to use the ABC or the activity base. Okay, so these are the possible use. The product line differ greatly in volume and manufacturing complex. So, most on the redesigning and installation of the product cost system. So, ginagamit siya pati sa decision making. Okay? So, ina-adapt ang ABCs in order for you to understand more on the decision making talaga and allocation of costs. Okay? So, I hope you learned something for today in understanding the activity-based costing. So, in case you have any problems or questions about the topic, just leave a comment or a message doon sa GC natin para mapag-usapan natin. And I prepared 4 problems for you to answer in order for you to apply the activity-based costing. Okay? So, thank you for listening and good day.